Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to this edition of In Conversation with Steve Quartermain. And today I'm delighted to welcome to the interview Hugh Ellis, Policy Director at TCPA. Hugh, just to sort of reassure you, there's no real structure to this. It's a conversation. The only structure is there's a beginning and there's an end, and somewhere in the middle there'll be some conversation. So I hope that you enjoy it as much as I anticipate enjoying it. Look, I'm delighted you've agreed to come on and have a chat. I suppose I want to ask you to begin with about why you think we have planning. I mean, what's planning all about? What's the purpose of planning?
I mean, right now, that's just a really important question, isn't it? Because I think that certainly in my career, there are two views of planners, aren't there? One is sort of traffic wardens of land, the most sort of unpopular kinds of people we might meet, and increasingly that myth of planners has been put out there. But I actually have come to think that planning is pretty much the most important kind of defining element of a civilized society, because I think it's asking the question, how are we going to live? And I think it's as broad as that, as creative as that. I think it's partly about engineering and technicalities and data. And of course, that's important for the moment because we're saying, well, we can replace people in planning with machines quite easily. But it's also a really creative and humane process about judgment that involves understanding the human experience and people's psychology and how they live and how they want to live. So I think planning is a general theory of everything. And I think that the really sad thing is that over time, that's not where most people are at, is it? Let's be honest. Most people see it as something to that. And so the fact that planning is now so denigrated, particularly in the debate around public policy, it is bizarre. The one thing, though, that is interesting is that even if you want to marginalize planning and you don't like planners, the things that we deal with are really coming to the fore, aren't they? And we might talk about this. So the evidence about health and well-being and place and the kinds of places we design, or the impact of climate change. So you can chop up the system and you can create different rules. If you can do that as much as you like, but the fundamentals of this question about what's the design of a civilized society? What should that be? So I still remain an incredible enthusiast for planning, not necessarily how it's always done right now in every place, but in terms of the ambition of it. And I think that we should, that's our ambition. But
it's interesting, isn't it? That, I mean, I can remember when I was on my, in fact, it was a geography course, and when I first got into planning, being introduced to some of the first settlements that were said to be planned. And I always seem to remember it was one called in Mesopotamia or somewhere that was, a planned city. So I mean, there is a bit about, without sounding a bit Douglas Adams, about, planning is everything, and it's about how we live and whatever. I mean, it's a bit about planning out to get things to work, and I suppose there's a bit of the question is, do we need a system to do that, or does it come naturally? Is it something that needs to happen? The economy needs to work, so it's bound to plan itself.
No, I mean, I think that's a root question, isn't it, about what the forces that try to discredit planning is, that somehow we're involved in some awful kind of Stalinist social engineering. But of course, everyone's planning. The corporate sector is always planning. The basis of all human organisation is what makes us distinctive as a species. We plan, we organise. The question is whose plan, isn't it, and whose organisation, I suppose, is what's at really heart of the conflict. And it is true that in a complex, advanced economy, lots of people want to do different things, and the planning system is in the hardest place of all, trying to mediate all of that, isn't it? It's trying to say, actually, in all of this, it's about the public interest. When I went to work at the TCPA, because the organisation is so old, what really struck me is you can see the periods of time before we planned in terms of those outcomes. And yes, they met the needs of immediate market forces in the 19th century industrial city, but the price paid for that in terms of the human lives and human experience was just far too high. So planning is always going to be in a position of mediating that. I think what's sad about it is that really great economies, German economy, Northwest European economies, have strong planning systems, and at the same time, that drives innovation. Regulation drives innovation. And if you're not careful, deregulation, getting rid of thought processes around planning is a rush to the bottom, isn't it? That's the outcome.
Yeah. So if we're planning, and you mentioned the public work, a lot of us worked in planning, public sector, and spend a lot of our time talking about planning in the public interest. But why do you think the public aren't more engaged with planning? Well, why do you think that it's not, you know, in the conversation down the pub every week and in every village hall? Well, why don't people sort of really think planning's important to them?
It's a real paradox, this, isn't it? Because my experience of being in the pub, although I don't always admit I'm a planner, but if I do admit I'm a planner, people will talk at me all night about planning. And I think people are talking about planning all the time. It's the biggest local issues that they have to confront. And people are fired up about it. I don't think they necessarily connect that with an interest or enthusiasm for planning or planners as they understand it. But they're asking that question all the time in towns, cities, places all across the nation. It's the thing that fires people up. You know, why aren't there enough GP surgeries? Why is public transport capacity? Why is my home this price? Why isn't there a socially rented home for me? These are but they don't see that necessarily as planning.
No, I used to do a question and very often say to people who's made a planning application, and a certain number of people put their hands up, and then who's objected to a planning application. Usually, relatively more hands used to go up for that. But if I ever asked who's been involved with our local plan preparation, there were very few people in the room that ever put their hand up now. I'm going to come on to some of the government reforms, but do you think that more could be done to actually get people involved in the plan making? I mean, neighbourhood planning was seen as a big step towards that. What's your view on how neighbourhood planning is sort of played out?
Well, neighbourhood planning it's interesting because the white paper seems to extinguish neighbourhood planning, so we'll come back to that. But it's interesting that there might be a 10-year bookend for neighbourhood planning, which is fascinating in itself. But I think we have to be clear. My pathway into planning came from community activism, and I reached the heady heights of being a parish councillor, and I never understood what planners told me. And then I went away to train as a planner and came back and to the same parish council and gave them a presentation on planning, and they all said, well done, we have absolutely no bloody idea what you just told us. Because you learn a professional language, don't you? You learn some kind of view of it, and it disconnects itself from humanity. So at the moment, we're just having this fascinating conversation about the art and science of planning. And in fact, the art bit has been quite considerably forgotten. And what that is, I think, is the ability to talk to people, the ability to see, to have a sensitivity to human experience, and not to say to people, I'm sorry, that's not a material consideration. I think that the whole culture of planning became quite narrow, has become quite narrow, and forgot this massive Colin Ward inheritance of community development. The first skill for a planner is, well, as you know better than anyone, the ability to talk to people, to be empathetic, not to shut the door on them. And yet there haven't been the resources there to do that. So interestingly, that if you wanted to really reform the planning process, it would be about skills and resources and culture, but that's not what people want, is it? They want to chop up the system. But actually that would have made the biggest difference to make planning more open to people.
But do you think that sort of society's got a bit more complicated now for planners to sort of make their mark? Well, I once did an away day for planners at CLG, and we had tables marked out with famous planners, you know, Abercrombie and, you know, like all there. But when I looked around the room, I found that there wasn't any name on any table that was current, or that was currently practicing. Now, I just wonder whether from the sort of early part of last century to post-war, whether society was just more about recovering from the awfulness of the war, the trying to rebuild the country. Whereas 60 years on, it's got a bit more complicated, and it's less binary in terms of just doing it. I mean, do you think that's a problem for planning?
It's a fascinating question. You know, what happened to planning? Because I think when the late great, I mean, obviously, apart from you, Steve, but
present company accepted.
But as present company accepted. But apart from the late great, when Peter Hall, when he died, that was like Gandalf dying. You know what I mean? That he was the last kind of person that, you know, there was this sort of grand figure in the planning world. And you're quite right that it's hard now to see where that kind of stature has gone. But I think there are lots of reasons for it. But part of the reason is that the pioneers of planning expressed themselves in all sorts of ways and were part of a social movement, weren't they? They were part of a very powerful set of moral ideas about how people should live. When the profession is only becomes identified professionally and loses that kind of wider social connection and agenda, then I think it's easier for politicians to disregard it at whatever level, and it's easier for it to become isolated. But I do feel a great sense of responsibility that collectively we've not been able to get that message across about planning. It's not for the want of trying, I don't think. It's not.
I mean, there's some great plans out there. I mean, there's some people doing some great stuff.
There are.
I suppose it's just a question of the status, which perhaps brings me to the white paper. But before I do, there's one question I meant to ask you for something you said earlier about stuff that has been developed and gone. I heard someone on a webinar talk about conservation areas all predate the 1947 Act, and they were a testament to the fact that there could be great development. Otherwise, why were they conservation areas? And I listened to that statement, and I found it, well, obviously it is true that there are lots of conservation areas that have historic buildings in them, but it's surely not the case that they're the only bits left that have come through the planning system, or a building system rather, which suggests that you don't need a planning system.
I mean, it's almost impossible to have a sensible conversation about the benefits of planning when there's a group of people who profoundly don't want to hear it. But I'm looking out my window, and when you think of the achievements in the 20th century of planning, it was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the origins of this planning movement: developed and designed the council house and deployed it, developed national parks, preserved the countryside, built 34 new towns that housed 2.8 million people, and of course accumulated a serious list of mistakes, which high-rise housing is always the one that's thrown at us as being the most serious. And those mistakes, interestingly, do have something in common, which is when the system stops listening to people, the results can be really difficult. But this country, the planning is a defined part of the culture of this country. And you know what, I'm tempted to say to people, you knock yourselves out deregulating the planning system, because although in the short term, I'm sure they have gone down that line, ultimately it's not what people in the thousands of communities in England want. And there's a buffer stop here at some point. Now, I think the challenge is that you can point to planning, you can denigrate planning, as national politicians have, and has been done very effectively by think tanks, and we've not been good necessarily at defending ourselves. But ultimately, these root causes and the real benefits that planning have had are real, and we are going to need a new system if we smash up the existing one. Yeah. People are still going to want the basic things out of that, actually, in terms of a decent place to live.
Yeah. Well, let's come to the white paper. I mentioned status, and the white paper talks about every local authority having a chief design placemaking person. I mean, is that tantamount to everybody having a chief planner?
I mean, it's difficult because I think trying to find positive elements in the white paper is a challenging hobby. I think that the emphasis on design, and that in particular, that there has to be some benefit in that. But what's really interesting is the question about what power local government will have, even if they have a chief planner. So, because there's been so much deregulation of things like PD, we just saw that 2 weeks ago, that I'm beginning to ask the question, and it's a private question between ourselves, as if nobody's watching. What's the point of local government in urban areas when you don't control the change of buildings or the demolition of buildings on large swathes of your patch? So I think that there is a paradox at the heart of this, which is that there's definitely a desire to get local government and local people and planning out of the way. But at the same time, there is the building better, building beautiful agenda, isn't there, laid over this, which is about design and beauty and those things. If we could get back a serious respected position on planning and design in local government, that would be brilliant. The question is, would they have any agency to do anything under the new system? I think.
Well, I suppose there's a link there to what we were saying earlier about neighbourhood planning and the idea that you'd have design codes and you would codify the sorts of development. The white paper picks up from the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission's report and specifically the words about provably popular designs being things that should be expected to be delivered to it. You mentioned neighbourhood plans and the future of them. It seems to me that it might be said that they seem to be very much in that space of codification and setting out what the outcomes might be expected.
Mm.
Do you see that as a future, or do you see that? Do you think they're threatened?
I think that, I mean, it's difficult to read the white paper and frankly be able to understand what's intended, because white papers traditionally, and we've read a few of them over the years, are very detailed documents. They're normally quite boring actually and slightly academic, and they give you a lot of detail about what's intended. But the section on neighbourhood planning is pretty extraordinary, because other than saying, well, these things are a good idea and we want to keep them, that doesn't give you any indication how they'll fit with the new system. Because if codes are set, if these 3 zones are set and codes are set for the growth zone, you have a neighbourhood plan that's in a growth zone, what is the role of the neighbourhood plan if the codes are already set separately to that in a local plan? So there's a lot of detail. Now let's just accept that your heart of your question is about whether codes work in general. The answer to that is, well, it has long been within the agenda of certainly those in number 10 to get rid of discretionary planning. And this white paper certainly does this for some parts of the framework. I think the problem with codes is that they can bring benefits and they have disbenefits. The disbenefits are they're incredibly inflexible. So, and then the real heart of this debate is, so what's in the code? There's no point saying, let's have a code that secures beauty. I want to know what the scope of these codes is going to be, because they're going to have to do everything from sustainable urban drainage to zero carbon, as well as to aesthetic design. And the limitation of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission was their concept of what beauty was. For me, there is no beauty without justice, which is actually what Ruskin said, because some of us have read him. And so these codes are going to have to be very extensive, incredibly detailed, because they're going to have to deal with every eventuality, aren't they? Because automatic permission is being given. So when you bring a development, you allocate a zone for growth, the level of detail that these codes will have to have is extraordinary. Or if they don't have that level of detail, and it's just about some broad design pattern book stuff, then we'll know the game is crooked, because actually it's not about the full range of issues that you need to deal with. And the thing about that, Steve, is it's not about us being difficult. You know, given things like flood risk, surface water flooding, the list of requirements, as you know, that you need to get into a development are not made up by planners being difficult. They're trying to stop people dying from flooding. And that's how bad it's going to be from a climate change point of view. So this stuff is really important. But, you know, at the end of the day, unless somebody's going to tell me what's in these codes, which is not in the white paper, it's just really difficult to judge. Maybe it's a good idea, or maybe it's simply a cover for deregulating.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned, I mean, talking about sort of what might be the outcomes of the codes, and sustainable development is in the white paper as being the test for plans and presumably the test for development. I mean, as an outcome for the planning system, sustainable development, addressing climate change have always been key objectives. Do you think that, firstly, do you think the system currently does it? And do you think the white paper is going to either change that either better or worse?
Well, I think the system struggled with it partly because, you know, defining sustainable development's always been the great challenge, hasn't it, in policy, and we've had more or less clear definitions of it. I think there's no doubt that sustainable development is there. I think when we finished the Rainsford review, where I can now confess how comprehensively we were ignored, although funnily enough, I still think it's a much more sensible and measured approach to the reform of planning than the white paper contains. But I think there's no doubt that the biggest issue we found about why planning kind of washed up and down on these political tides was because there wasn't this anchor. There wasn't this clear legislative statement saying this is what the system is for. And the components of that for me are very clear, really. It is about public interest, not just private interest. It's about democracy and sustainable development. But increasingly, I think it's about health and well-being, particularly post-COVID, and particularly post-Grenfell, and particularly the issue that's come up from some permitted development of windows and kids in car parks. The system has to be very explicit, I think, about that, because it cannot be and never should be growth at any price. It is not about build, build, build. It is about quality, well-being, sustainable development. That is real legacy in society. And if that's what you want, then you need care. Care is a word we don't use much, I don't think, in planning, but we need a system that cares on every level, properly assessed, properly evidenced, but cares about the outcome.
Is that a good description about why those people who are thinking that they need to deregulate the planning system for who are free marketeers, who say the market will do this, and might see planning as being a bit of a left-wing sort of way of controlling how people live their lives? I mean, how does a system try and allow for both enterprise and profit and people to make money from the planning system, at the same time protect the public interest? Or is that the problem we've been trying to grapple with for the last 70 years?
Well, it is, isn't it? I mean, it's hard. I mean, that's what I want to say to people who write, simplistic solutions to planning. We're trying to do something about democracy and markets and regulation. We're trying to do something really hard here. It's not easy. It's not colouring in maps for land, which is sometimes, I think, how people see it. It's difficult. But I think it's about where the pendulum has swung to. And in the balance, there's definitely swung too far, I think, in terms of a free market view of it. There is no history of successful free market solutions in land ever in history, because the consequences of that are always, depending on your frame, on your moral frame, the consequences of that are always extreme. And the interesting thing about deregulation, for example, which I think has been nailed a number of times, is that this white paper won't build a single additional home, because actually it's the development model which we've recognized is the real problem here. It's a dominant private sector highly speculative development model, which will not build the homes that we've allocated. So I think the LGA's figure, whether you think it's precisely right or not, of 1 million homes, permission for 1 million homes outstanding. What we do know is the planning system's been consistent, delivering 110,000 more than we've been building. And if you wreck the system, which I think the white paper will effectively do, partly because of the disruption it will cause, you won't at the end of it find you building anymore, because the private sector has no interest in that. The only way, interestingly, of doing that will be to get back to a much stronger public sector role in the delivery of homes. So what I think, if a definition of something that's stupid is something that harms the person and harms the people they're trying to do something to together, then this has to have that label. It is not going to work in practical terms. So there'll always be this argument in a mixed economy between these two ideas, but the balance is wrong. And also, in terms of the outcomes on health and climate change, we have to be much better organised if you want to save the coast.
So apart from perhaps resubmitting the Rainsford review as part of your response to the white paper, are you going to talk a bit about the Healthy Homes Act, which you've been, TCPA have been sort of talking about for like a year? I mean, is there a solution there?
I think there is. I mean, just before I say that, I mean, the great thing about this conversation is that that I've got the reputation for the least influential person on planning reform in the whole of England, which is absolutely true. So I think it's nice to be a bit more open about that with you, Steve, because government didn't listen to the Rainsford review and hasn't listened to previous reviews of planning. And you know what? That's fine. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that we think we're going to be influential. But it is interesting that the Healthy Homes Act has gained.
There are bits to the white paper which you think, I mean, I'm a great fan of the idea that there'd be a digital system. And I do think that is a way of doing it. But there's also a lot of stuff in there that I just don't think people have picked up on yet.
I think so.
The neighbourhood plan stuff is why would you bother, to be honest?
Why would you bother? Precisely. I think that it's difficult because if you read it critically as a planner, you start automatically to try and work out how that would work through, don't you? You try and say, well, how would this work? But the white paper doesn't do that. So I think people, because of the vagueness in it, I think people can read into it almost anything they want to read into it. And that's one of the great challenges. But I think they'll be hit hard on the democratic question.
I think there's just a gap. The point you made in the talk about ideology and the stuff. I mean, there's a gap, I think, between the practical pragmatic delivery stuff. So, for example, if you're going to have a street-by-street neighbourhood plan with codes, what is the process for that? How long does that take? Who gets involved with it? Who examines that? What does that cost? And so once you start factoring all that into a context of a plan that's got to be done in 30 months, or when you look at the 4 stages of that, you could read it to say that you don't really get a public engagement until they submit it to the Secretary of State at the same time to consult on it. Now, in practical terms, it would be a very foolish local planning authority that didn't consult during the time they're writing the plan, but that isn't actually embedded in the document. There's just an expectation that if it's all digital, people will be looking at it. I think that the neighbourhood plan stuff is well, more work needs to be done to try and say how does this all go fit together. I really do.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's not got that level of detail. I look forward to them. I'm not sure it's deliverable in its current form. In fact, I'm confident that it isn't. So the Section 106 stuff, you just by saying you'll yield more by having a national system, that all depends on the factors you have on viability, doesn't it? So what are you going to expect to place on land?
I think the issue will be that, I mean, one of the things that Kit Kat did say was this was a paper full of big ideas that call for big thinking. And I suppose that's the invitation, you know, to respond to some of the questions, which, despite the fact that they're a bit weighted at times, but then that's to be expected there. Do you agree with us? Is one of the main questions. But there are opportunities for people to comment on different options and different alternatives. And so, you know, I do think people should seize the opportunity. And Hugh, you may yet be listened to.
Well, I don't think so, but I do think there's an interesting issue emerging that I was actually talking to Nick about, which was really funny off the record, where he said in the old days, you know, as I was saying, I think white papers used to be very boring and academic, you know, from government and people. That's the, you know,
I ducked that one.
And the lobby groups would submit these sort of very shouty papers, you know, about what should happen. He said the situation's now reversed in a way. That actually, you know, what you're getting from a white paper, which isn't a white paper really, is it? Is actually, as you say, a collection of ideas and proposals and thoughts and big ideas, very green paper stuff. And Rainsford now appears to be really boring in comparison, really dull and full of evidence and not really very, you know. I mean, that's just a sign of our changing politics, I guess.
It is. Hugh, I'm going to let you get on. Good to see you. And let's hope that sort of September, October, that I can actually meet you in person and get you a beer.
That would be. I really look forward to that, Steve. Been missing our chat.
It's been a while, hasn't it? Okay.